Hello everyone, I'm JG and welcome back to Music Forever, where today I'm bringing you guys a new track review video where I get to talk about several recently released songs, released in the past couple weeks or so, and just share with you guys my thoughts on them pretty much. So, with that said, let's get into talking about the first song I want to talk about here today, this new track from Sum 41, A Death in the Family. Overall, I thought the last single that Sum 41 dropped a few weeks back was pretty decent. I mean, it was pretty typical for the band, but at the same time, it wasn't really bad either. I thought it had a pretty great guitar solo attached to it as well. Overall, though, I think this new single that they've dropped is an improvement over that last one. I think there's a lot more going on in this track that's really worth getting excited about when it comes to this new album they're going to be releasing next month. For one thing, I think the instrumental on this track overall is just a lot more interesting. I love the riffs across this thing and the darker sound that this track has going for it. Not super dark by any means, but for Sum 41 and the sounds that they typically play around with, this is definitely a bit of a darker tone that they're going for here on this project. And I think the riffs match up really nicely. They're almost like, I guess, almost like alternative or new metal-ish in tone, but this isn't a new metal or alternative metal song by any means. I think the sound works nicely for what they're going for here. I do wish the guitar solo on this track was a bit longer because it is a bit short and what you do get of it is pretty good overall. I just wish it was a bit fleshed out more. But still, I think the instrumental across this track, for the most part, is pretty solid. I think the vocal performance on this track is also pretty good as well. For the most part, you have Derek doing his more aggressive delivery across this thing. You can tell he's got a lot of energy going on here in the vocals, and some of the more clean, calm vocals that come in at several points on this track serve to just add a lot more texture and flavor to the vocal performance across this track. Overall, what he's doing here on the song is a lot more interesting than I think what he was doing on that last track they dropped. And for the most part, pretty much what they're doing for the most part on the song as a whole when it comes to the performance is a lot more interesting here on this track than that last one that they dropped. I do think the lyrics here on this track might be a bit simplistic, but I mean, it's not the worst thing in the world, I guess. It's still pretty okay at the end of the day, and I think this is a pretty solid song from the band. Not one of their best or anything, but still a pretty good song at the end of the day, and I'm looking forward to this new album from these guys if we're going to be getting more tracks like this. Moving on, the next track I want to talk about is this new single from Big K.R.I.T, K.R.I.T here. Big K.R.I.T's last studio album, Forever is a Mighty Long Time, was one of my favorite projects of 2017, and one of my favorite double albums in recent memory. Definitely a project you should check out if you haven't done so already. He also dropped a trilogy of EPs last year that I thought were pretty okay. They weren't really great or anything, they just kind of seemed like they were made to fill the gap between his last studio album and his upcoming one. And, I guess in that context they work fine enough, but, I wouldn't really return to them or anything like that. But coming into this new track here, I was hoping to get some more great material from Big K.R.I.T. But overall, I honestly think that this track reminds me a lot more of those trilogy of EPs that we got last year than it does some of his better works from the past. Because there are good aspects to this track. I think this is a decent track at the end of the day. There's just other aspects I think hold it back from being a really great song and getting me really hyped up for this new album. I think the overall vibe of this track is pretty good. It sounds really triumphant and uplifting and inspirational to some extent as well, which I guess does make sense given that lyrically K.R.I.T is talking about his come up here on this track and how he's been able to make a name for himself, especially coming off a project like Forever is a Mighty Long Time, which had a lot of critical praise thrown its way. It all makes sense, and I think this dynamic works really nicely on the track. However, if you take the lyrics on their own, I'm not the biggest fan overall. Not because they're particularly bad or anything, they're just not super interesting. Like, the stuff he's talking about here on this track is stuff that I've heard him talk about before in other contexts, but just more interestingly than he does here on this track. And it's just not particularly exciting, a lot of the lyrics on this thing. They're not particularly clever or smart or funny. They're just kind of there for the most part, much like a lot of the lyrics that appeared on that trilogy of EPs he dropped last year. Primarily why this track reminds me of some of those songs. K.R.I.T brings a lot of charisma to this track, and the overall production on this thing is pretty great as well. However, I just can't help but feel like this track isn't anywhere near as ear-catching as a lot of the material, or the best material that he's put out in the past, and overall this kind of feels like a bit more filler like we were getting on that trilogy of EPs. Hoping that the rest of his upcoming album will be a lot better, who knows, maybe it's just the first single that's a bit of a dud, but, this is still a decent track at the end of the day, certainly one I would recommend to big K.R.I.T fans and even just hip-hop fans in general, but it's not one that I think I'm going to get a whole ton of mileage out of in the long run. Moving on, the final track I want to talk about here today is this new single from King Gizzard and the Lizard Wizard, Self-Immolate. This is a pretty interesting track. This and the last single they dropped, Planet B from this upcoming project of theirs, given that it sounds really different from what the sound that they were doing not too long ago on their Fishing for Fishies album they dropped back in April. A project that I was kind of mixed on overall. You can check out my full review of it if you want my further thoughts on it, but I thought it was kind of average overall. There were some highlights, but it didn't really stick with me all that much, and a couple months later I still really don't care for it all that much. This new sound that they're going for here on these couple of tracks, though, this thrash metal sound, is one I like a lot more. Not just because I like thrash metal a lot more than boogie rock, but because I think King Gizzard put a pretty interesting spin on it. I think Self-Immolate is a great example of this. While this is a thrash track through and through, I like how with the guitars and the overall sound of this thing, King Gizzard are able to bring some sounds that almost sound a bit like stoner metal-ish, which I guess, given that the band has definitely played around with tons of different psychedelic sounds on previous projects, makes a bit of sense here. It helps give this album a personality of its own that's very different from a lot of other thrash metal out there. I like thrash metal quite a bit, but a lot of bands out there nowadays, whether they be new or old, are, kind of in a bad habit of just repeating a lot of ideas that already exist out there and just kind of releasing typical project after typical project. I mean, I haven't heard this full album from this band here, but based on these two singles that they've dropped so far from it, they definitely have a very interesting twist on the thrash metal genre going on here. They have these thrashy riffs, really great guitar solos, but they retain this kind of rugged stoner metal-esque sound that I think is really interesting. I also really like the production on these tracks and how it doesn't sound too stiff or clean sounding. Yet another problem I have with a fair bit of modern thrash metal, how it can sound a bit too sterile at times. Not the case with this track, which has a very rugged, aggressive sound to it. It just sounds very natural, and that's how I like my thrash metal, so I enjoy it here on this song. I also like the lyrics that the band brings to the table here on this track. Once again, they're able to keep their signature brand of quirkiness here in the lyrics, kind of talking about being on the surface of Venus and kind of like being engulfed in flames as a result of this. It's weird, but in a way that I think is really fun and quirky, but at the same time really metal, so I guess it makes sense that they would bring them to the table on a metal track. I also quite like the vocals across this song too. I like how rugged they sound. They almost sound like something you'd hear more on like a sludge metal or stoner metal record than you would a thrash metal record, but I still think they work really nicely in the context of everything else that goes on here in this track. I also like some of the cleaner vocals you get during the chorus of this song as well. I think, once again, they just add a lot of texture to the vocals here in this track and make it a bit more interesting. Overall, I think Self-Immolate is a pretty great track from these guys, and I'm pretty excited to see what they do with a full album in this thrash sound, considering, based on the couple of singles they've dropped in this sound so far, they can do it pretty nicely, and these are a couple of the most interesting thrash tracks that I've heard in a good long while, which I didn't expect from King Gizzard of all bands, but, I'll happily take it. But that concludes all the tracks I want to talk about here today. If you happen to have any opinions on any of these songs different than my own, that's perfectly fine. In fact, feel free to leave them in the comment section down below. And while you're down there, make sure you leave a like on the video and subscribe to the channel for more music-related content, things like album reviews, track reviews, things of that sort. So if you enjoy that kind of content, make sure you subscribe. Thank you for watching once again, and stay golden.